So first things first, our program is basically year-round. We have 3 phases of development that we like to do. So we have the in-season, the off-season, and the preseason. Each of these phases focus on a different aspect of goaltending. So if we're in the in-season, we're going to be focusing on different things just because we're in the middle of the season. So we're trying to focus more on having more consistency as we get through that hockey season. In the off-season, because goalies are no longer playing at that point or not playing as much because they may be playing other sports or they're just playing spring hockey. So they're just doing little tournaments here and there. The focus of that phase of development is going to be a little bit different. And then when we get into the preseason, that is closer into the summer, this is where goalies are getting prepared to get into their tryouts. So the way that we train the goalies will be a little bit different in preparation for what's about to come in their tryouts. What we're going to go over as we go through this presentation here is we're going to discuss what the philosophy of each of our programs are. So the ISD, the OSD, and the PSD. But first, we're going to give you a quick little overview as to what we do in each of those programs. So irrespective as to whether you're doing the ISD, the OSD, or the PSD, there will always be a classroom session, which will be focusing on the concept of what we're going to be focusing on that week. Then we have the on-ice session, which is where we develop the skills themselves. Then we have a video, meaning every session that goalies do when they're on ice, we are recording. And because we record, and when we record, we then take those videos and we upload them into a folder that is individualized per goaltender. So if your goalie is in our program, they'll have their own personal folder. We'll have different types of videos on there. So if they're part of the OSD program, they'll have their videos from the OSD sessions. If they're in the ISD program, they'll have their videos on there. If they're in a PSD, they'll have their videos on there as well. If at any point too our students are playing games, they want us to see their game clips, they can upload their videos into that folder as well. So every student has their own individual folder that we record when we're on the videos that we record when we're on ice, and they can also use those folders to upload videos of their own games. And you have journals. Journals are basically these things right here. Every goalie that is part of our program gets a journal, and we teach them how to utilize it so they can reflect. So the classroom focuses on the concept that we're going to be focusing on. The on ice is for the skill itself. The videos that we record are there for them to review, and then they can utilize their journals to reflect. Is there anything you guys would like to add on there when it comes down to the concept, the skills, the review, or the reflection?
Not necessarily like adding anything, because we're obviously going to be going through a lot of the process, but just the idea of like how the 4 things, the classroom, the on ice, the video, and the journal, how they connect. If we let's say eliminate one of those things, let's say you eliminate the classroom, what happens is you end up taking away from your on ice, because you're going to have to do a lot more of the concepts on the ice rather than on the ice ready to prepare to work on skill development. And then again, when we talk about the on-ice skill, how that still translates into understanding tactical sides of the game, actually applying those skills to the game. And that's where, again, the video review comes into play, where we can have better communications with understanding the whys and hows rather than just, hey, look at this cool drill that we're doing. And then the journaling, it gives sort of self-reflection. So you really, through getting into the programs and understanding the OSD, ISD, PSD, and how they connect to each other, it's the whole basis is to have like a full model of growth rather than the idea of like random sessions or random ice times. Because anytime you randomize anything, there's really not a lot of progress that can be made. So the whole theory behind these things is to sort of condense things to a better understanding of why. And if you eliminate any of those 4 things, if you eliminate one, you're actually taking away from the other. So the whole idea of building a full plan rather than the idea of having such a small perspective on what goaltending is. And a lot of times people just say, oh, it's stop the puck. Well, yeah, I would love to stop every puck, but it's not that simple. There's way more to stopping the puck than just, hey, get into position and butterfly, man. So to understand like the program model and understand all of those things connect to each other, and then every one of those programs connect to each other as well. The ISD complements the PSD, which complements the OSD, and they all complement each other. So the whole idea of understanding playing a whole game comes from building a proper model.
Yeah, and just thinking about how learning happens, like that's why all of these are important and integral to the development models. Like, because when we learn, like there's always like a zooming in and a zooming out. Like if you zoom fully into a technical skill. So for example, we were talking about shuffling earlier before we jumped on. So I'll use shuffling as an example. Zooming in on the skill of shuffling. You know, it's a movement, but understanding why you shuffle in the broader picture of the game, it actually allows you to, as you were saying, Justin, to use the time on the ice really just to build repetitions of that skill. And I'll go a little bit higher level to think about like how we learn skills. You know, we talk about learning skills as an adaptation in our brain. Whenever we're learning anything, there's adaptations in our brain that happen. Basically, the term muscle memory, which we don't use, what it refers to is long-term potentiation. So building connections through neurons and then having those connections, basically the analogy I use is paved. You know, for example, if we're very new at a skill, we can think of it like a dirt road, something that has been worn down a little bit, but as you get better and better repetitions, eventually that dirt road becomes a super highway where connections and neural impulses can travel very quickly and almost without having to pay attention. So the layers of learning are first when we're starting something, we're very novice at it. And when we're novice at it, everything is super conscious. You know, I'll use the scale of a shuffle. You have to think of like transferring weight, loading, gathering, extending, retracting your backside foot, staying in your stance every time you shuffle. And you have to tell yourself to do that and consciously think through it. Then as you start to build repetition, you get better at it and you have to think about it less and less with the ultimate goal of automaticity, which is not having to think about it at all. And understanding the why, understanding the bigger picture by going through the classroom, on ice, the video, and journaling and reflecting, all of those are ways to build repetition. They're ways to get positive reps. And then, as you say, when we get to the on ice portion, we don't have to take that time. Again, our ice time's super limited. We only have an hour. Usually our sessions are about an hour. So if we have to take a half an hour of that session to review the concept of why we're shuffling, what situations we're going to, that's taking away from our time to actually build positive repetitions of that skill.
Yeah, I think that connects to with the idea of taking a layered approach. So one thing that I think differs us from the rest is our ability to be able to explain very broad concepts into, or very, very hard concepts to understand and bring it down to its fundamentals. So in every program that we do, whether it's the ISD, OSD, or the PSD, we always start off at the fundamental layer, and then we just build on top of it as we move forward. So our ice times always build on top of each other. So we're never going to go from working, let's say, on lateral feeds to switching over to breakaways, right? It's like there's a path that we take that we slowly move towards, where every detail and every concept that we discuss, we can see how they layer on top of each other. So everything that we do is observable, and what makes it very easy for goalies to understand over the long term is it always follows the same string of logic. So we start off with the idea of the positional elements, and from the positional elements we'll go to direction of movement. From direction of movement we'll be able to move into the idea of coverage, and so on and so forth. So as we keep moving forward into our program, the goalies are able to utilize the details that they learned earlier on into what we're going to be doing that's more complex later on, and understand how these things connect, which really makes goalies understand that the position is not as complicated as they think it is, right? It may seem complicated when you're coming in from the outside, but if you have a good understanding of the fundamentals and you apply the same rules and the same logic that we applied later on in the earlier layers to later layers, it's very easy for goalies to understand how these things connect. And from there, it really makes them understand the approach that we have, and the also understand like why they're doing things a certain way. There's no, if you go from one thing and you have a certain set of rules and you go to another thing where the rules change, it's very difficult for people to have an understanding as to why that disconnect is happening. But with our goalies, because we're keeping that same layered approach the whole way through, it really allows them to understand why. And if they understand why, if they struggle at working at a skill, then even though they struggle at it, they understand why they need to continuously work at it. There's nothing more frustrating as an athlete if you're trying to work on something new and you don't understand why you're working on it, especially if it's difficult, right? If it's something that's very difficult to get good at, and you don't see how those things connect into what you've done in the past, or it connects to your game, then it's very easy to just letting go and no longer wanting to work on it. But if you're able to have that layered approach where you understand why that skill is important and where it's going, then even if it's difficult, goalies will want to continue working at it.
And that's a super important part about bridging the gap from like the conceptual to the physical. Like we talk about the theorizing and the concepts and the base layer, the fundamental layer of understanding. That base layer of understanding, we can know it, but that doesn't mean we can actually implement it. And that's why, I guess, going back a slide, but connecting these two together, why having all of those four components are so important. Because some goalies are very athletic, very physical, maybe struggle with the understanding side. Other goalies are really conceptual. They can understand why, but might struggle with the physical implementation and physical application. So the way we take this layer approach is to make sure that we can bridge that gap between the understanding, the actual on ice physical application, the skills, and then having that chain of command going through the skills, understanding that each skill connects to the next. So if there's any point where we have to slow down and we have to really, really emphasize the skills, sometimes we'll go through an ice time, we'll redo the same thing because we'll see that like we're not ready to move on from that. Because if we don't hammer down and don't really, really build one layer of skill, we're not going to be able to move up the chain, move up the layers, so to speak.
And that goes into just to sort of speak the language that a lot of the goaltending world speaks. So many times you hear the term simplify, but the thing about simplifying is simplify doesn't mean dumb down. Simplify, there's if you want to simplify something, the best way to simplify is to know more about it. If you can know more about it and understand that there's layers, and that layer is going to, if you accomplish that first layer, that second layer is going to be easier to grasp because that first layer was the foundation of understanding how they connect. And when we talk about simplifying, well, simplifying is not to dumb down and say, oh, just move there and go down. Get there and butterfly, man. That's not a way to simplify the game. To simplify, have a better understanding of why and how. And if you can have a better understanding of why and how, again, if you're working through layers and you're working through acquiring skill, that understanding of why you're doing it gives you way more motivation to try to accomplish it as well. And if you can accomplish that first layer, well, now there's a second layer to add on to. And when we talk about the idea of technique and being technical, the whole idea of being technical is the more technical you are, the better tactics you'll be able to understand and apply. And if we don't ever understand those things, that's where the randomization of drills and the idea of like, oh, check out this cool drill. Hey, everyone, try this cool drill. Well, if there's no concept behind the drill, what did we just do with our time? We put in a whole bunch of work, but did we get really better or have a better understanding at working forward to try to get better? Probably not. We might not retain anything from those drills, because at the end of the day, you're doing such random situations that it doesn't actually connect to anything. And so by understanding like the layered approach and taking a more serious model of how you want to try to progress in the game, every dot connects. And if you can understand that if every dot connects, but you miss a couple dots, have you guys ever done a dot to dot before? My son who's in grade 4, they did some dot to dot stuff, and I showed him the one day, like, if you miss 5 dots, what is your picture? It's nothing. It doesn't look like anything. It looks like a bunch of lines that don't belong. So if you connect every dot, again, you get to see the whole picture. And the whole idea of the idea of building a proper model and really putting in the time and the effort to understand, like, from square one fundamental, allow that to get to the top of the pyramid, man, there's so many steps in between. And if you try to skip steps, you end up falling back to the bottom. And I think that the whole idea and the problem with a lot of the terms that we use is the idea of simplify. A lot of times people think simplify means like dumb it down, say less words, have less information, when in reality, the more information you have, the easier those things are to understand.
I like the dot to dot example, because not only, yes, if you miss dots, your picture is going to be messed up, but if you take the wrong order as well, right? If you go from dot 3 to dot 7 and then back to dot 4, you're not going to get the correct answer as well. So the order of operations is extremely important. It's just as important as the actual operations themselves.
Totally.
And it's something that we're very open with our goalies. We've discussed it. Actually, we're in the ISD program right now, in the middle of it, and we're focusing on post connections. And from our post connections, we I think we all hoped that we were going to be able to move on to the next step a little bit faster. But at the end of the day, it's like we did feel like the consistency was there. And because the consistency wasn't there, we just decided to stick to it a little bit longer. And we're very open with the goalies about it in our classrooms. And every classroom we have, we always reflect back on the week and for each group and discuss what we've been noticing as a coaching group. And just this last week, as we said, it's the skills were there. We're able to see the goalies. We're able to implement it and do it once in a while, but the consistency just wasn't there enough. So if we see the consistency is at 50%, we're not ready to move on to the next step because we're not consistent enough to be able to move on to the next step. So we decided to just take it back, focus on it again. The following week we did. Not a consistency was high enough or sufficient enough for us to feel comfortable moving on to the next step. So it's one of those things where, as much as we'd like to be able to, plow through what we need to go through very quickly, we're not scared to just take it a little bit slower, focus on what we need to focus on, add the consistency. Once the consistency is there, then moving on to the next step.
Can I just use an example? I just want to use an example of one of the guys that sort of joined us as a client little bit later in his career, and it's Oscar Dansk, and Oscar's awesome. I have nothing but really good things to say about Oscar. Not just his abilities and his skills, but him as a person. He's like a genuine human being. And one of the things that like when he started to come in and he started to come in regularly, one of the things that he said to me a couple of times is he's like, man, like this information is so unique, but it all makes sense. So he's like, I just want you to understand, like when I pause, I'm not pausing because I'm like trying to question what it is. He's like, I have to try to really understand, like, what I was doing before, there was not a lot of thought or any theories behind it. So now connecting the dots to like the way the skills connect to the actual outcome of a play. He said, like, I not only visualize head, but he's Swedish too. He speaks English really well, but in my head now, I really have to conceptualize what is being asked of me because I've never actually thought about that before. It always came down to like, turn my eyes and save the puck. Well, okay, that's way more steps involved in that. And so as soon as he started to really break down the idea of like, there's concepts and there's layers that we're gonna build on this. And then he told me when we were talking about just like rotation and backside push stuff, he flat out told me, he's like, man, like this makes way more sense. I never really understood. It was always just work harder, rather than the idea of working with a purpose. And as soon as you can really focus on that, there's purpose behind all the concepts, and there's reasons that things happen. Well, now, man, the dots in that dot to dot become more clear. You can start to see the outline of the picture before you've even connected the dots. And as soon as you start to think more along those lines, those dots connect faster and faster. And again, without that model and without the concepts, you're just doing drills. And at the end of the day, that anybody can come up with a drill, right? When I say anybody, there's been times where I've had somebody come to me and say, hey, I'm really struggling with this. Do you have any drills? And it's like, really, the drill isn't what's important. It's the concept that's important. You could have a drill. Let's just talk about RVH real quick. An RVH connection, like you said, we had to take a step backwards because we didn't feel like we were consistent enough. Well, you can do dynamic drills with RVH, but if we're not detailed enough with RVH, you can go back as simple as like starting on your feet, no movement, starting on your feet. Here's an RVH setup. Here's a better way to set up RVH. You break down those points and instantly you're going to start to have that feeling. How many times I've seen those guys have that feeling of like, you start to implement a skill and you talk to them, and then as soon as they do a drill, they look at you and go, oh, that feeling, that thing that you just felt, that's efficiency. That's not a matter of like that by being better at that skill. That was efficiency that you just felt. And if you're feeling more efficient, well, now the next dot that you connect is going to enhance that even more. And by enhancing even more, again, you're climbing up that pyramid. And eventually when you get to the top, now everything is an instinct rather than a thought. And that was like one of his things. He really was like, whoa, like I can't believe how fast I was able to connect that dot, because he'd never thought about the actual real theory behind it before. And again, when we talk about the details and what's important, it's not the drill that's important. It's the concept and the actual idea of where you're going to take that next concept that connects to the next one. It has nothing to do with the cool drill. And that's one of the biggest issues that I think is like a lot of times people, I get inboxes all the time, like, do you have a drill to work on this? And it's like, man, get it. get a crease written down, put a G somewhere where you're starting, and reenact that situation. The drill isn't important really at all. It's more about what's inside the drill.
That reminds me of a quote from The Art of War. I can't pronounce it, by Sun Tzu, where
So yeah,
I'm gonna paraphrase it and I'm probably gonna butcher it, but it's something like the man who makes many calculations has a much better probability of success. The more calculations you do, the more success you have.
yeah.
A man who does few calculations has a low probability of success. So what do you think about someone who does no calculations? And that goes back to like Oscar Dance slowing down and trying to think about it. It's like the calculations in his head. He's playing it over, calculating it. If I do this, then this happens. And then the more thought, the more times, or the more you can actually understand like the if then, the contingencies. If I do this, then this happens, the much higher your probability of success is. And that goes to, like, we'll talk about our ice times a lot more, but on our ice times, guys might get 5 to 10 reps per side. As opposed to simply just going through 40 reps, and the idea of like putting in more thought rather than simply working harder. We're improving probability of success. We're improving efficiency, even by doing less repetition.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to be able to review your videos or reflect on what you did without having the understanding of the concepts that are underlying everything, right? It starts off with a concept, then we got to work on the skill. Then from working on the skill, we can review, and then we can reflect after, right? So everything is always connected in every ice time. So as you guys said, when it comes down to Oscar Danks, really thinking about what he's doing and really trying to embrace those concepts, then it was easier for him to apply the skill. And then later on, when he goes home and he reviews his videos, he's actually able to know exactly what he's supposed to look for, right? If you don't understand the concept and you're just doing drills and you review your videos, you don't really know what to look at. And if you don't really know what to look at, then it's hard for you to be able to reflect on what you need to focus on moving forward.
Absolutely. And that could also fall into the scouting world as well.
Totally. And so now we'll get into the programs themselves, because we're going into the off season very soon here, starting in April. The hockey season is about to end, at least for minor hockey. If you're playing professional hockey, it's a little bit of a different story. Your season is much longer than the average person. But when it comes down to goalies that are playing minor hockey, they will be ending sometimes in March. So typically in March, unless any goalies have tryouts that are coming up, whether it's a provincial team tryout or whatever the case is, or like spring camps for junior teams, we usually try to get the goalies to take a little bit of time off and then come back into the spring in April. And this is where the off-season development begins. Now, the off-season development, because in that time frame, most goalies will not be on the ice as much. They might be playing other sports. They might just be playing spring hockey, where they just go to some tournaments here and there with their friends just to compete and have some fun. The amount of ice times that they have are limited. And same thing for OSD program. We only want the goalies to skate once a week. We're not trying to compound too many goalie ice times on top of one another. This is like a perfect time for goalies to take a break, enjoy different things, but also because the amount of ice times that they have are limited, it really changes their mindset towards having more quality ice times. When you're on the ice a lot, especially during the season, this is where the quantity comes in, and it's very, very hard for some athletes at least to really focus on the quality of their reps because there's so much that they're doing all the time. And we also have a lot of goalies will discuss goalies and parents will discuss how bad habits are built throughout the season. And those bad habits are not necessarily built from gameplay. They can be built from gameplay, but often those bad habits are built from practices, because often goalies are put in situations in practice that are not going to see in games. So if you have a coach who does a drill where the nets are close together and are tight against the boards because they want the players to work on in tight situations and battle and compete. As a goalie, the puck isn't so tight from you all the time. Maybe you're going to be spending the game on your knees the whole time. You end up adapting to the drill itself, not necessarily to what you would be seeing in games. And those drill adaptations are where goalies start building quote unquote bad habits. So the off-season development, because goalies are not on the ice as much, now we focus more on the quality of their reps. And we focus on rebuilding a strong foundation, a strong structure. So if you're a goalie who's never really worked with us in the past, this is usually a very good starting point, because this is where we will focus on technical skills only, and basically try to build high quality reps at as high of a volume as we can. Obviously, if your details are in the middle of our drills and your details are not very good, we're not going to try to compound bad rep over top of bad rep. We're going to try to focus on quality reps. And so if it's only 10 quality reps instead of 15, it'll be 10 quality reps. But at least what we're doing is we are building strong, high quality repetitions, and that's how habits start being built. So the offseason program is focusing on skill acquisition, which comes back to the fundamental layer of our pyramid, which is technical skills.
And the important note there too is pace. Part of the reason why it's so difficult for athletes to actually work on technique and skill in season is because when they're in practice, the pace is being controlled by the coach and being controlled by other players. One example I'll use is everybody knows how like our goalies train and how they make blocker saves. If you watch our videos, our goalies make blocker saves quite a bit differently than other goalies. Our goalies will eliminate their stick, toe will come up to their chin, and they'll be able to use their hand very freely compared to what other goaltenders that we've seen where like stick stays hard on the ice and they have really limited arm mobility. Now, that's just an example that a lot of people know and a lot of people have recognized through our Instagram videos. Now, in the offseason development program, if we wanted to take a day where we're working on blocker usage, we're controlling pace and we're controlling reps. I can say we're going to work on blocker technique today. We can take your stick out of your hand, but I'm going to shoot every puck to the blocker side. And we're going to really build that high volume, high quality repetition. After each one, we'll come and talk about it. In a practice, you don't get that opportunity. You don't know where a player is going to shoot. So even if you wanted to work on your blocker save technique in practice, it's very challenging because there's a lot more layers of difficulty. There's the situation that you're seeing. Is it a 2-on-1? Is it a power play setup that you have to think about? There's the fact that the player can shoot anywhere. They don't necessarily have to shoot on the blocker side. So now in season, in practice environments, it's very, very difficult for us to actually get the repetition necessary at the pace and slowing down the pace so that we can actually build a skill. So that's why when the season's over, it's a really, really good time because we can control that pace and we can really isolate certain elements that we want to focus on.
And to take that, just take that a little bit further, a lot of times, and I know that some people might not take too kindly to this, but the idea of hard work, I'm not a big person that believes in priding yourself on hard work, because the thing with hard work is like, who can work hard? Well, anyone can work hard. Instead of focusing on the idea of hard work, let's work hard with purpose. If there can be purpose, rather than just working to exhaustion, let's work purposefully. And if we talk about just repetition real quick, and the idea, I know we touched on briefly here, the idea of muscle memory and how muscle memory doesn't really exist. Your muscles don't have memory. Your hip doesn't have a memory. Your brain has memory. So when we talk about the repetition and slowing the repetition down, it's not necessarily it's easy ice times. Let's just talk about positive repetition. Positive repetition is way more likely to enhance a skill quicker and have more belief in that skill that becomes an instinct. So for instance, if you're doing 10 repetition and you do 5 bad and 5 good, the 5 bad actually take away the 5 good. So if you do 10 reps and now we're tired, 5 bad take away 5 good, well, you just left a drill at 0. You're tired, you're sweating, but did you actually acquire any skill, or did you just go through the motions of that drill? And so the whole idea now, when we talk about the OSD and we talk about like why it's significant, this is where we're trying to acquire the skill. So if the skill isn't executed at a level consistently enough, that's where we should slow down the number of reps and really enhance the skill. Because if you can enhance the skill, now as you enhance that skill, the more reps you do in a positive environment, in a positive way, that's way more likely to become retained. So you've retained the skill, and way easier to execute without any thought. It becomes instinct. And the whole thing, when people talk about like conscious mind and subconscious mind, is truly what we're trying to do. We're really programming your subconscious mind, and how we're doing it is through positive repetition. So you're really, instead of understanding it with, oh, my legs are tired today. Well, why are your legs tired? Your legs are tired because you did enough repetition in a positive way that skill is now an instinct, rather than it being, oh yeah, muscle memory, 10 more, 10 more, 10 more, where those 10, because you're getting more tired, you're cutting more corners. Because let's be honest, as human beings, when we get tired, what does our body do? Tries to take the shortest path. We try to cut out a lot of the details so we can actually still execute it. So instead of just working to exhaustion or working to be tired, let's work to get better rather than just be tired, because tired goaltending is not the greatest goaltending.
And that's part of our job. Like our job on the ice is being able to recognize where the goalie is at when it comes down to their tiredness, right? If there's a goalie that we're in a drill and they're looking good, they're feeling good, and we're able to compound more reps, then it's our job to be able to recognize this and try to get more reps into the repertoire so that we're really able to, over time, as we compound those reps, build stronger habits. But if we see that as the goalie's going, they start getting tired and the details are starting to slip, then it's our job to be able to stop it and just like reset to then get back at it again. Just because, again, our job is to make sure that we're getting the most out of our athletes, and to get the most out of our athletes, we need to make sure they're compounding proper repetitions, high quality repetitions. So it's something you'll see is sometimes you'll have goalies who, even goalies that are very skilled, will work with NHLers who we might notice they're getting tired. So we're going to stop the drill. Right. And there's other guys that are maybe a little bit younger and they've got a high level of energy because maybe they haven't taken a break for a while. They're looking solid, and their details are good. So we're going to try to compound more reps as we go. So part of our job is being able to recognize where the goalie is when they're going through the drills, and be able to manipulate a little bit like their output, so that we're able to use their energy in a way that, as you said, we're not just expending energy, we're expending energy for a specific purpose, and our job is to be able to align that energy in the proper direction.
And that sort of relates to the idea of connecting what we do in goalie sessions, goalie training, to what you actually do in a game. Because that is 100% our job, is to connect everything that we do on ice in a training environment to something that you're going to do in a game situation. And to be fair, I'm sure there are times where goalies get tired in games, you know, if you have to kill a 5-minute penalty, so to speak. But if you look at the average shots against per game and ballpark at around 30 shots in 60 minutes. Well, in practice, you'll see 30 shots in 4 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes. So when you actually like look at connecting what we do on ice to what we do in a game situation, very rarely are you tired, or should you be tired. You have long breaks as a goalie. If it's an even game, you will likely have long breaks where your team has possession of puck, or the other team takes penalties. So for us to focus on like doing more reps, getting tired, and to do conditioning, so to speak, that's not really connecting anything that we're doing in a training session to what you're going to be doing on ice. And that's something that could be dealt with in the gym as well, not something that should be dealt with in a training environment.
At high levels, the whole thing with goaltenders not playing back-to-backs, it's not necessarily a physical break. A team plays Friday, Saturday, the starter or the 1A plays on Friday, and then 1B plays on Saturday. That's not necessarily because of the workload. It's more about the idea of like a mental break. There's lots of preparation that goes into these things. And if you had to consistently go through that preparation, eventually you're going to feel a little bit of burnout. So the whole idea, again, in terms of back-to-back nights, yeah, you might get peppered one night and feel like the next day you need a little bit of rest, but at the end of the day, that's not why they're going on the back-to-back switching guys. It's more of like a mental break. It's not the physical side that really burns you out.
So now we'll move on to definitions. And the reason I say definitions is the OSD program really focuses on technical skills and acquiring skills. But everybody has a different definition of what technique actually means, or a different conceptualization of what being a technical goalie actually is. There's not too long ago, Ben, you were talking about the idea of robotics, right? Like a goalie being robotic. And that's one thing that, you know, sometimes you'll hear people talk about how goalies are too technical, which we would disagree with, because ourselves, we would argue that a lot of goalies are not technical enough. The issue is not that they're too technical. The issue is that they're not technical enough. But then it comes down to the idea of definition, is maybe people are arguing for them the idea, the conceptualization of technical means robotic. But then again, we might disagree with this, because as you said, Ben, last time we talked about robotics, is your conceptualization of robotics is someone who is very, very consistent in the way they're applying their skills in a certain environment, right? If you're a robot is very consistent in their job because they do the same thing over and over and over again, which can be a good thing for a goalie, because if a goalie is able to handle a specific situation in a very specific way all the time, that will increase their consistency. So being robotic is not necessarily a bad thing. So, but now again, people's conceptualization of robotic might mean a different thing than our conceptualization. For them, it might just mean stiff or rigid, right? Which now maybe we would agree that that's not a good thing, right? So I thought it'd be important for us to kind of explain what we mean by technical, what we're looking for, and what we want with goalies to look like when they're going through the drills, what it means to us for a goalie to be technical in our ice times or even in general when we're playing games. So first, because I know you do you have a minor in philosophy, Ben?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I thought it'd be interesting for you to just kind of go over the philosophy of techne here.
Yeah, so techne, it's where the word technology or where the word technique comes from, and as you have on the slide here, techne analogy is the basically where our modern term of technology comes from. Now, the idea of techne is it's more around purpose as opposed to an actual skill. When we think of technique, we think of something very niche and very specific, but techne combines both the skill itself, so it combines the action with the reasoning and the end. And I find that extremely important when it comes to technique, because one thing that we see a lot is, again, Nick, going back to definitions, is when some people think of a technical goalie, they think of somebody who moves well and goes down. Someone who basically never has to dive, never has to spread. Basically, it's a goalie who is, yeah, you can use the term robotic because I think that's how people conceptualize robotic as well. But the idea of technique being more related to craft and being more of a combination of an end product, that's how we look at a technique. So like from our definition, technique, for example, some people would consider a goalie who makes a diving save not a technical save. We would disagree, because diving is a technique. Diving is a technique that you use to achieve a specific end in a situation. And for us, that end is always what we do in game situations. And so when it comes down to the techniques that we use, coming back to like the that 4 square slide, where there's always a concept behind it, the techniques we use will always apply to a broader situation. They'll always apply to the broader game situation of what we're actually trying to accomplish. And another example that I really like to use is the way we talk about movement. In our OSD, we'll do a lot of movement mechanics, a lot of extension retraction, a lot of backside push. And one thing that we see a lot is goalies C-cutting around pucks. So for example, backside pushing and stopping themselves. Well, for us, that is a technique, but that's not how we would describe a technical goaltender. Because if you're sliding and the puck goes the other way and you stop yourself, your body's no longer facing the puck. So sure, it's a technique, but it's a technique that doesn't have a specific purpose or end in mind. And so the concept of techne really guides what we do as a means of zooming in and zooming out, zooming into the specific actions a goalie will take, but more so zooming out to the reason that they're doing those actions to try to reach the end, which is the most efficient way to stop the puck.
Well, and I'm just going to jump on that real quick, because I think that's one of the biggest things. Is I think a lot of times people think technique is something should be the way something looks rather than the way it's executed. And I think that's one of the biggest things, what you just talked about just talking about the C cuts. Like so many people mask, in my opinion, it's a time waster, is all the C cuts while down and going through the American Ninja Warrior pylons. They're doing all the spins and the 360s, when in reality, like what's the technique you're working on? They're masking it as edge control, but where does that C cut down 360 apply to the game? And when you realize that it doesn't, then you're like, okay, well, so then what technique did we take out of this? And if you think about it, the whole idea of becoming technical is to have a tactical advantage. The more technical you become, the more skills you acquire that are actually applicable to real situations, that's going to give you a tactical advantage now. So now you're playing the game at a higher pace because your technique is good, and you can apply those techniques to your reads and anticipations. Now you're playing the whole game rather than just the position. And I think that's a big part of the idea of technique, is if you don't have the proper techniques, the game gets hard. But if you get really good at things that are really cool for Instagram, and it's, again, go back to the part of the cool drill thing, that's where you're losing the idea of how that technique translates to game-like situations. And if we spend a lot of our time doing things that don't actually apply to the situations, you're not actually getting technical. You're getting really good likes on Instagram, but the actual application to the game doesn't really exist. And I think a lot of people think that the technique thing comes from like a visual rather than an executional standpoint. And the whole idea of if you can execute better techniques, you're going to give yourself a tactical advantage.
Yeah, I want to read this definition because this is the one that I like the most. So techne refers to a concept signifying a skilled action guided by reason with a specific end goal in mind. And later on in the definition, knowledge is applied to produce a desired outcome connecting reason, deliberate action, and a defined end product. And so the defined end product is what separates, is what really separates technique from this concept of technique, and actions guided by reason with specific goals in mind.
That's it.
I think that's really where, I think that's honestly where we stand out.
Yeah.
What makes our program stand out is there's always the end goal, and then that's the zooming out as to what applies in a game situation. So technical goalies will spread, technical goalies will dive. Those are all techniques that are trying to achieve, they have a specific goal in mind, and we're trying to achieve the end product. So a diving goalie is a technical goalie. That is a technical save.
That's so just for and some people might not, so the younger fellas, goalies out there, Dominic Hasek, so many people thought Dominic Hasek, he was just kamikaze, but there was a method to his madness. He was very, very technical when it comes to like the way he understood coverage, how many times did he make a save without even looking at the puck? There was many times that his head was turned the wrong way, but he was able to make a save because the techniques that he had and his understanding of coverage and building that coverage allowed for him to make a whole bunch of big saves. It wasn't luck. It wasn't fluke. It wasn't he just diving into space because he had nothing else. There was a method behind his madness. And when you start to think about that, again, not many people would give him a lot of credibility for his technique, where he was very technically strong. I'd even go as far as saying like a guy like Tim Thomas, who played, I don't want to say a similar style, but he played very, very athletic and aggressive. But there was lots of technical methods in his game as well. He played within his strengths. He knew he was never going to look polished. He knew there wasn't going to be the pretty T-push cross crease and stop and set your feet, everything so calm and composed. He knew that he had to get off a lot of structure in order to make saves, but also that was part of his technique. He knew that he wasn't going to be that polished guy, so he played within his strengths.
Would you guys agree that that's when we differentiate between effectiveness versus efficiency, where, we've used Dominic Hasek a lot in our classrooms to really portray the idea of his technique being pretty solid, meaning sure, he would pad stack, sure, he would dive, but when you look at the direction of his movement, a lot of time it was very, very strong, right? But now if you take a lot of these clips, you could say, okay, this works, this was effective, but was it the most efficient way of doing certain things? So if, let's say, he's on his post, there's a puck that goes low to low, we have clips of him just falling on his back, and would I teach this to a goalie? Obviously not, but I would teach the same direction movement that he took, right? Totally. He took a proper direction movement. He's going side to side. He's coming back on an angle with his direction movement. Now the movement itself that he took, where he's just diving, not even diving, just literally falling on his back, I would not recommend, right? Yeah. So do you think that's where the differentiation is, where effectiveness is whether your technical skills are strong, and efficiency is whether you're utilizing the right technique for the right situation?
Yes. Well, and that's where I think the game evolved so much, right? Like that's where, again, his fallbacks and stuff. Now you see guys backside push, right? In those situations, and the whole thing of like how the game progressed. Understand when Dominic Hasek played in the NHL, I would question how many full-time goaltending coaches were in the NHL at that time. Not very many. So the whole concept of like the way the position was coached was so different back then. So when you get into like the idea, like we would call Dominic Hasek technical, but would you call him efficient? Well, in today's game, no. But in the game for him when he played, because it was so different, like you could say that he was a little bit more efficient than some guys, because frontside recovery, man. Frontside recovery was a thing back then no one even paid attention to. So because backside recovery became a thing at one point, and it's morphed into a lot more, but that whole thing, that again, when we talk about layers, is like now that there's layers because there's been more thought, there's been more experiment in the land of goaltending. So we have more efficiency. Could Dominic Hasek play that same way that he played back in the 90s? That if we were to make him 32 years old again and put him in the NHL right now, would he be able to play the same way? Probably not. There's new techniques that are going to make him more efficient. However, his instincts, because his instincts were so good, he still has that ability to understand coverage and direction of movement that's going to allow for him to put himself in pretty good spots.
And efficiency, a lot of times it comes down to, I don't want to say percentages because I don't like the term of playing percentages, but it does come down to your probability of making a save. So when you think of Dominic Hasek being on post and a pass going low to low and him just falling on his back, that worked. However, when you think of the calculation side of things, you look at a player's perspective. Okay, if this is how he handles that situation, if I can chip the puck over the side of his body, that's a goal. So now from there, that's where the efficiency starts to come in. This works 50% of the time. How can we make it work 60% of the time? How can we make it work 70% of the time? So the idea of efficiency comes from the improving our probability of making a save, not like the outcome of whether we make a save or not. It's efficiency comes from the what ifs. How can we make this work more often and then more consistently?
Shameless plug, but I wrote an article on Substack about technique, what a technical goalie is, and I differentiated between technical and technology. So I kind of viewed technology as, like Justin, you said, backside push, right? Backside push wasn't really a thing in the 90s. It was starting to get developed, but now it's something that everybody utilizes in their game. So would you guys kind of agree that, let's say, a backside push, your RVH, could we view these as technologies and then the application of it as the technique itself? Well, so the better the technology becomes, the more efficient the goalies become if they're able to adapt that technology and implement it with proper technical details.
Man, adding just confirming that whole process and that thought is like, what happened when backside push became a thing? Well, there was a technological thing that got put on people's skates, man, the overdrive blade. The guys put the overdrive blade on their skates because to backside push back in the day, the way the gear was built, it was like toe straps. Like you had toe strap. There were even the laces you were tying tight into the toe of your pad. So a lot of times when people were trying to learn backside push, they simply couldn't because they would lift their back foot to push, but their pad was so close to the ice that they'd slip every time. So the technology is someone came up with like, well, if we mount these small blades to the bottom of their cowling, now that slip out happens less. They're no longer pushing with their blade. They're pushing with the overdrive blade. That's where that backside recovery and backside push really started to come from. And it came from technology, man. It came from the idea of like, well, we all know getting up on the backside leg is the most efficient way because it's your push leg and you're going to be pushing the direction the puck is, but we're struggling with the technique. Well, instead of fixing the technique and fixing the way the gear is strapped, it was let's put a blade on the bottom of the skate. And as soon as the blade became on the bottom of the skate, man, everybody started recovering on their back leg. That overdrive blade became a part of. If you didn't have overdrive blades, man, I remember when I first started coaching, there was parents that were coming to me and they were saying like, hey, these overdrive blades have changed everything for little Johnny, that he can move way better while down and all these things. And then they made that blade illegal. Well, as soon as they made that blade illegal, man, now it's a crutch for everyone who has that on their skates. Now it's a crutch because that technique is so poor. So by pulling those blades off, and now the way gear is constructed, now you get better rotation on pads. There's landing gear. The toe lace is way looser, so your skate blade gets closer to the ice. So again, that whole idea, technology is what actually shaped that. So man, I think you're spot on with that idea. Spot on.
It's like it starts with thought. What comes from thought, observation, and then calculation leads into the physical world, which is then like, let's make gear differently because we have a better way to do things. And so, it leads into the actual skills that we do as well. So for example, backside push, when the overdrive blade was no longer allowed, well, we have to load and gather. Let's talk about loading and gathering and transferring weight better and redesigning gear so that we can make this mechanic consistent.
That's it.
Awesome. So the next thing is, well, we're all familiar now with what we believe technique is. But now, how do we use this to structure our on ice times? Because when we're on the ice, obviously, like we said, our goal is to have purpose and high quality reps that we're able to compound the repetitions. So first things first, we're going to go back to something you mentioned earlier there, Ben, when you talk about neural pathways. We want to have high quality repetitions. So that's connected to having positive creating new neural pathways that allow us to be able to implement that skill properly. But I think there's a misconception between creating new neural pathways and focusing on reinforcing reinforcing the better ones, right? Like we hear this a lot often in the goalie world, how we're doing this to create new neural pathways. Are we trying to create new neural pathways, or are we trying to reinforce the good ones? Could you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think the idea of reinforcement, I mean, new neural pathways, if something is brand new to you, of course, like I like the analogy of roads. If there's no road or a trail, you have to start by building one, or start by walking the path so that the grass gets trampled down, so to speak. So there are times where creating new neural pathways is necessary, but most of the times what we are trying to do is strengthen the ones that we already have. So going back, Justin, to your example of doing 5 reps well and 5 reps poor, basically what you've done is if you think of a neural pathway, you've created 2 branches. Created 2 ways that you could handle a certain situation. One is the proper way and the other is non-proper way. And if you trample down that path individually, neither path stands out. So when you're trying to implement that skill in a game situation, which road you're going to take is uncertain. However, if you do, say, 8 positive reps and 2 non-positive reps, what you've done is you've created a much better road on one side than the other. And then when it comes time to making a decision, like if I'm driving a car, if I have to pick what road to take, I'm going to take a highway instead of a dirt road. It's going to be easier on my car. I'm going to have to think about it less. There's less chance of me running into any complications. Whereas if I'm on a dirt road, I might get a rock in my car. It's going to be really bumpy. It's not going to be very efficient. So that idea of neural pathways, we actually don't want more of them. As Nick was saying, we want stronger neural pathways. Again, we'll apply this to a specific situation of handling a butterfly sliding on a high to low lateral feed. If we have proper technique, we maintain vision on puck, rotate, load, gather, extend. If we do that half the time, but the other half the time we don't rotate, when this happens in a game, we're likely to take the path of least resistance, which is not rotating and not getting back on angle. Whereas if we create that super highway of rotating every time, it becomes unconscious. It's a very, very strong neural pathway. So it's not that there aren't 2 different neural pathways, it's just that one is much, much easier to take than the other one. And that's the one that we want to continue to reinforce.
So taking that into consideration there, Justin, like, could you explain how it is that we take those concepts and apply it to our ice times? Like how do we structure our ice times for goalies to know what to expect?
Well, the whole idea, again, if going back to the very first slide that we talked about in terms of like how the dots connect, first of all, the first thing is understanding the information. If you don't understand the information, or if you don't understand the idea of like the direction that we're trying to go with trying to develop the skill, again, you can work really hard, but get nothing out of it. So you lose sweat, but you don't actually get anything. And the whole idea now, when we talk about structuring ice times, going back to the layered approach of understanding, well, where does this skill, first, let's understand the skill. If we can understand the skill, if we can acquire the skill, once the skill is acquired, now we can translate to where that skill actually happens in games. And then once you start to translate where that happens in games, now we talk about the idea of application. So now you first of all acquire it. It no longer, it becomes an instinct. And like you said, Ben, with the different neural pathways, if you have 2 neural pathways, but one is way more dominant, and that one that's dominant is really helping and is more efficient, well, now that's starting to become more of an instinct. So now the decision in a game, you no longer have to think, oh, I'm down, how do I get to that rebound? So we've drilled it enough that you are, and the mechanics are clean and the details are all there, that you've acquired the skill. No longer are the reminders of how to execute the skill. The skill is an instinct. Now, as soon as the skill is an instinct, and you can translate those now into where this happens in the game. And then as you find out where it happens in the game, now it's a matter of application. You start to apply it all of a sudden during practices. I talk to guys a lot about the differences of practice where you're practicing flow drills, or if you're practicing real hockey drills. If there's flow drills, there are things that we can take out of those drills where it turns more into prioritizing the skill within the drill rather than the idea of playing the game. And there's a difference between playing the game and practicing. And so if you've acquired the skill and you understand where that skill translates, now all of a sudden in practice, when you start to see those game situations, as soon as there's no longer a decision that needs to be made, it's instinctual. Well, now that translation is turned into you're applying and you're applying it in real time and in real situations. So now that skill, you still have to drill it, and there's still areas of focus that will need to happen, but now there's no longer a thought. And as soon as we have to start to think consciously, that's where we really have to make decisions. And by making decisions, the game of hockey happens way too fast. It's way too dynamic to play consciously. It's really hard to try to translate those in games. So there's lots of situations where when working on a skill or trying to develop a skill, you need to really focus on the skill first. Because if you just talk to someone about a skill and say, hey, this is where it happens in a game, but they can't execute the skill in a repetitive fashion, well, now a thought has to happen. And as soon as the thought has to happen, by the time that thought has happened and the skill now executes, there's a good chance that the puck's already behind you. And as soon as that happens, now we're no longer playing within our instincts, we're playing consciously. And as soon as you play consciously, think about driving a car, Ben. We'll go back to the idea of driving a car. If you're driving a car, I use the analogy a lot with younger kids. Like, so you're in your car, you're in the car driving to this ice time today with your mom and dad. Your dad's talking to you, oh, hey, how was school? What'd you do in school today? Well, as your dad's having that conversation, well, what's driving the car? Well, his subconscious mind is driving the car. He's not talking to himself saying like, oh, the red car in front of me just hit its brakes, I'm going to have to stop soon. That's not what's happening. He's driven the car enough to know and understanding the distances, and a red light happens. Well, he's still able to have a conversation. Did you eat all your lunch? You're going for a lesson today. I hope you have enough energy, but you just stopped at the red light. So who stopped at the red light? Well, that was the subconscious mind. So the whole idea, again, in terms of how we break down acquiring those skills, is understanding, for one, let's execute the skill so it becomes an instinct. Then let's translate to where that skill applies, and then let's work on applying it in those situations. And now you're applying that skill to the game rather than just the position.
And going back to how we structure on ice, very slow one-on-one instruction, no shooters. When you first learn to drive a car, you do it in an empty parking lot.
That's it.
Because there's not a lot that you have to really pay attention to other than push the clutch, shift, release the clutch, push the gas at the same time. For those of you that know how to drive a standard, not sure it's super common anymore. But it's one of those things you first learn to drive in an empty parking lot. The same way you first learn, we'll tell you where we're shooting. We'll do limited movement ahead of time so that you can actually focus on the save mechanics themselves, kind of thing. That's the idea of slowing down the ice time.
And that goes back to the idea of acquiring the skill, right? That not everybody can just get in a car and jump right on the highway. Not every kid's going to jump on the ice and learn backside push in 1 hour and be able to, hey, we can move on from that. And that's the whole idea, is like, in terms of the OSD and acquiring skill, that's the reason it's the off-season development, is there's no consequences. If you're not playing games, there's no consequences. So why are we running around trying to solve game problems when in reality we're not playing games? Let's acquire more skill. So as we slow things down and acquire more skill, once we start to move forward, that's where we can really put that into game context and allow the development of really playing the game rather than just position. And I'll be honest, I think that's one of the things a lot of misconceptions is there's differences between playing the game and playing the position. The position is a very, very technical, tactical, hardest position to potentially play in sport. And there's a difference between just being in that position and applying that position to the game.
Everybody slows down what they do. If you take, let's say, Formula One pilots, for example, you might not need to bring them back to a parking lot and learn how to shift properly, right? Like those neural pathways have been built up over time quite a bit. But it's one of those things, like they'll often go on the racetrack on their own and work on basically slowing down when they're supposed to and reaccelerating when they're supposed to in specific turns. And you'll have some coaches that will say for hockey, well, you don't want to spend too much time on these static drills because the game is very dynamic. Well, same thing goes for the Formula One driver. You're not going to go in the race and be on your own on the racetrack. You're going to have multiple people that are going to be there. But if you don't know when to accelerate, when to decelerate, when you're like just doing it on your own, how will you be able to perform it when there are other drivers on the road on the racetrack at the same time as you? Same thing goes for us, as if we're on the ice with NHLers. Which when they come back, usually we'll see them again in July because their season goes a little bit longer. So they take their break structure is going to be a little bit different than minor hockey kids. But we always go back to the technical skills. It's not just because you're playing minor hockey that you have to go back to your technical skills while everybody else can just do tactics. The pros come back and work one-on-one with us on their technical skills, before we even introduced shooters. And even Justin, you said last summer, I think it was with Aiden Hill, where you guys went, his brother came out to shoot, and it was too early, a little bit too early before it was time for him to get back on the ice with shooters in that development phase. So irrespective as to whether you're a minor hockey goalie playing AAA, AA, or community, or you're an NHLer playing at the highest level in the world, when you finish your season, you get back on the ice, you want to slow things down and get more static with your drill so you can rebuild those proper repetitions into your repertoire.
So I'm just going to take this two ways. The first one is, and it's when I started doing jiu-jitsu with my brother. When you talk about the idea of technique translation and all those things, I remember doing jiu-jitsu with my brother. I think it was my second class. And again, in really good shape, pretty strong. The first class I wasn't allowed to actually roll because I didn't really know any techniques of like I could bear hug somebody, but I didn't really know what I was doing. So by like the second class, he's like, okay, we're gonna roll. You're gonna go into live rolls. And of course he puts me with Lori. I don't know if you remember Lori, but she was part of I think she was like Team Canada Olympian for wrestling, not jiu-jitsu, wrestling. And she's like 120 pounds. At the time, I'm like 175 pounds, really good shape, pretty strong. As soon as he puts me with Lori, I looked at him like, really, man? Like, I'm going to bench press her and it's going to be no problem. She worked me. She absolutely worked me. It was the most humbling thing. And the reason she was able to work me is she knew techniques. She knew way more than I did about jiu-jitsu and about wrestling. So she totally worked me. It was a super humbling experience. And then I'm just going to go back to and just connect with one of the NHLers that I worked with through his whole career. Well, he played in the NHL, Chad Johnson. Chad Johnson, one of his best years that he ever had was, and I don't know if you remember this, Nick, but one of the best years he ever had was when he came back at Christmas. He was playing in Buffalo and he came back for Christmas and did a couple sessions over the Christmas holidays. I don't know if that's really what was really, it might, back then it might not have been a big deal, but I don't think that's allowed now just due to the NHLPA. There's contract stuff and insurance things happen in contracts. But that was one of his strongest years. And one of the reasons was there was such a refresher at the Christmas break for him that his details were super crisp when he went back. And that I think Robin Leonard got hurt. And I think that year he ended up playing, I think it was like 43 games or something like that. And he had a 920 save percentage and a goals against average of like 230 or something like that in Buffalo, which was they had a losing record, didn't make playoffs. So when we go back to those things, like what was different in that year? And it's just his details were that much more crisp because we were able to do refresh. I think we did 3 ice times and it was just all refreshers. There was nothing to do with, we didn't get dynamic and didn't get into like 5-on-0s and handling traffic and all these things. It was more about like just feeling good and being more comfortable with details. And man, he had his best season all year, his whole career. And it comes down to, again, in terms of like the on ice structure is, he plays in the NHL. When he came back over the Christmas holidays, we could have done tons of different situations. I could have brought out 3 shooters, 4 shooters. We could have run a whole practice, but instead, let's go back to foundational things that actually are real. And as soon as we got into that, man, he went and shot the lights out. I remember that year. I remember like watching and going like, holy, like this guy is proving that he's a number 1 in the National Hockey League right now. Like he could be a number 1 guy. And it was, again, you could even see it in his game. He was so crisp. He believed in himself. And you could definitely tell that second half he was a different guy.
Yeah, the difference between a novice and an expert is most often only experts can do the fundamentals consistently and in every situation. When there's high pressure, when there's a lot of puck movement, games are puck movement's very dynamic. The only difference between a beginner and an expert is how consistently they can apply fundamental skills.
Yeah.
Now, keeping this in mind when it comes down to your own ice structure, what are you guys' thoughts on age groups? Because for us, when we do the OSD, we don't segregate the goalies based on their age or their skill level. We kind of put them on the ice together, but we do it a little bit different for the PSD, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So why is that? And what are you guys' thoughts on this?
I think a lot of times the age group thing can become an excuse for someone. I think that if you're real and you really want something, the other people that surround you, whether it be on ice or in a boxing ring or on a jiu-jitsu mat, I think that if you're saying, well, too low, think about when doing jiu-jitsu, man. I know you trained a lot longer than I did. I think you became a blue belt. I'm still a white belt. So because you're a blue belt, you're not going to roll with white belt. Like that, man, there's still
Purple,
lots to
better
learn.
color. I'm a purple belt. I got the
Purple,
better
sorry.
color.
There you go, man. There you go. Purple. My bad. And again, that's again a testament of like understanding information, right? So the whole thing that comes down to, I think a lot of times that's an excuse unless there's like a tactical thing that you're working on. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that later on in terms of like the reason we separated the PSD rather than the OSD. And it's because the information is still the same, whether you're 25 playing pro hockey or you're 13 playing U13, the information is still the same. So how you can conceptualize the information, it stays the same. The issue would be now the levels of play. If you put a 25-year-old playing pro in a tactical environment where you have shooters and you're running drills and you have American League shooters on the ice, well, that 13-year-old is going to have a tough time. Where if you put them more with their peer group, they're going to be able to understand where those skills translate and get executed, right? So I think when it comes down to like even some of the younger guys that get trained, I know for a fact, man, when we did that one session with, I did one session where someone paid for a silent auction item where it was a lesson with me and Aiden were on the ice and the goalie came out. They realized being out there is like the skills are the same. Like we're still doing the same foundational work. Just, it might be a little bit more, in terms of like the dynamics of the drill might be because again, I've been working with Aiden since he's 10 years old. So the dynamics of the drill might be a little bit, more dynamic in some ways because Aiden and I are now on ice time 6 of the summer and he's joined us during ice time 6, but at the same time, the skills and the foundation stay exactly the same. So there's not really any deviation of, okay, I'm going to teach you this, but in 4 ice times, I'm going to change the way it is taught or the way it's applied, because that's not true and it's not real either, right? And I think that's one of the ideas of again understanding the acquisition of skill is if you don't acquire the base layer, well, man, the layers above it are way harder to attain. And again, I think when we break down the differences between a U13 kid and a guy that's played in the National Hockey League, the foundation is the same.
It's exactly the quote that I just said. Expertise is nothing more than doing the fundamentals extremely consistently. Everybody has the same base layer of skills to work on. Now, keep in mind, as coaches, it's our job to be able to challenge differently and to notice different things. Like 2 goalies could be working on one could be 24 in the NHL, one could be 10 learning how to T-push. We could be doing the exact same drill, working on mobility. One guy we might have to talk about load and gather with. The other guy we might have to talk about north-south head movement with. They're working on the same skill. It just comes to us to notice what elements of that skill need to be honed in and refined.
Yeah,
that's again comes
to
us doing our job. Yeah.
And that comes down to like being observant, right? And that's where I think like the idea, like what we're being observant on and what we're being observant for. I mean, everybody can state the obvious, right? I think being involved as long as I have been in this game, I think that's one of the things is like stating the obvious is no longer that hard or the goaltending is so mainstream now and there's so many things going on that stating the obvious is really not, man, going through game reviews where I've seen other guys apply game reviews and all the game review is the person on the other side is telling the goalie what's happening. Well, why are you like, to me, that's a waste of time. You lived it. You lived in that moment. I don't need to remind you what happened. Let's get away from stating the obvious and let's be a little more observant and find out reasons why and how.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when we're working on technique, it doesn't matter what your skill level is. The technique is the same across the board. We're talking about jiu-jitsu earlier. A single leg takedown, the technique's the same whether you're a novice or a black belt. It's the exact same. Now, the application of it might be a little bit different, and that's what we'll get into when it comes down to the PSD, and that's why we start segregating based on skill level a little bit more, just because the way that you apply that single leg takedown might be different than the way somebody else applies it based on their playing style, right? Or their fighting style. So same thing goes in hockey. So the way that you butterfly side, the way that you T-push, the way that you support your saves with your back end, the way that you extend and retract, that is all the same, irrespective as to whether you're playing U13 hockey or you're playing the NHL. So keeping that in mind, then there's not really much of a point in segregating, especially if we're the ones shooting, right? If you bring out shooters, like you said, Justin, well, if you have American Hockey League shooters on the ice, that is quite different for a U13 goalie than it is for an NHLer. But when we're the ones that are shooting, we can obviously adjust our intensity of the shot and all these things based on who we're working with, right? And another thing that you guys mentioned was the concepts that we focus on. Like Ben, you used the idea of a T-push, right? So for a guy who is more advanced, we'll discuss the concepts of being north-south a lot more, versus a goalie who's a little bit more novice. We'll talk about the extension or retraction of their movement. So part of our job when we're working with those goalies, even if we're doing the same drill, is to figure out in the hierarchy of things what it is that we need to focus on the most, right? So the pro goalie might be a little bit higher up the chain of command, where we focus a little bit more on that seventh layer, while the younger goalie, we're focusing more on the second layer instead, right? So that's why when we're working on technique, the technique, we don't necessarily need to segregate the groups, because the technique is going to be the same across the board. We're shooting, so that takes away the volatility of having different shooters on the ice at a different skill level. And it also, it's our job now to really focus on the layer that we need to focus on with depending on who's in net.
And I'm just going to take that into the jiu-jitsu thing real quick again, just so again, the stories align. So when I did my first roll with Lori, and she totally worked me, man. I remember she so we started on our knees, and it was there was no like standing takedowns. And so I obviously took her down, got on top as if I'm like going to start to impose my will. And man, all of a sudden I'm swept, and she's got my arm. And when she got my arm, I was like, in my head, I'm like, I'm just going to arm curl out of this. I started to arm curl out of it. Her hips changed. I'm tapping like, whoa, she wasn't going to break my arm, but my elbow would have popped for sure. So then 3 months down the road, this 120-pound female just worked me over in jiu-jitsu. I do 3 months of training. Then there was a guy, Jared Evans, who I've watched many times, huge, jacked. I've watched him fight MMA, man. I watched him suplex a guy in MMA, suplex him into a guillotine choke, and almost pulled the guy's head right off. And I dominated him for a 5-minute round. Like, I was on top. He was rattled afterwards. He was right mad at what happened during our roll. And again, I didn't win. I didn't tap him out or anything like that, but I maintained position for 5 minutes. I didn't let him, he was defending the entire time. And as soon again, when I accomplished, like when the bell rang and that round was over, I stood up. That was a huge win for me, because it was like, holy smokes. Like 3 months ago, I got tapped out by a 120-pound female. And now I've got this guy who I've watched fight in MMA, and I lasted a whole round with him. And again, the whole thing that came down to is like, I added layers to my technique, and I had a way better understanding of how to play jiu-jitsu. And it was awesome. It was such a huge win for me. It inspired me to go to more classes, because it was like, holy, I am making progress. And when you translate that to hockey now and goaltending, it's the same thing. When you start to see kids that the dots start to connect, and you see that they're moving better and they're putting themselves in better spots, they're making more saves. That's where like it gets good. Hockey is just like any other sport. When it's fun is when you're playing well. And if you can understand that development and understanding the foundation and building the foundation, you're going to start to play well more often. And as you play well more often, man, it's inspiring to go to the rink to work on those things.
And it is important to note too, bringing it back to on ice and skill development, using the jiu-jitsu example, is it's like, not only do you have to know what to do and the timing, you actually have to know how to do the skill. Yeah. And that's the important part of the on ice. It's like, you can understand conceptually when a pass goes, I rotate, butterfly, slide, stay north, south. You can understand that, but you also have to be able to do it at the same pace that you're playing at. And that's what we're actually working to develop on ice, is the how do you do it?
Awesome. So basically, EOSD, we are focusing on technical skills, acquiring skills. But then once we finish UOSD at the end of spring, typically we'll finish UOSD sometimes in mid-June. This is where we, again, take a little bit of a break, let the goalies relax a little bit, and then we get back at it in July at the beginning of the summer. And this is where we enter into the preseason development phase. The preseason development phase is where we focus more on skill application. So while we were focused on the acquisition of skills in the OSD, in the PSD, this is where we try to apply those skills in game situations. So this is where, if we worked on our technical skills of supporting with our backhand, extending, retracting, now we try to see how this fits in the broader sense of the game. So how do we apply this when it comes down to net play, when we're down the RVH and we have to move low to low off our post? How does it apply off the rush? All these different tactical situations is now where we try to utilize those skills in the PSD. Now, when we get into the PSD again, the really theme of it is tactics. So when you think about like the Greek theme of going from techne to tactike, this is where when you think about warriors and bringing back in those days, yeah, you might know how to defend yourself with a shield and how to use a spear, how to use a sword, but how do you use it in combat? How do you utilize these technique in a tactical environment? Are you able to adapt based on what you're doing? So this is where tactike is the concept that refers to ordering, arranging, and assessing. So this is where we assess the situation based on the way that we're assessing the situation. Our order operation might change, and we have to adapt to that situation and apply those skills in the way in which we believe is the best way to handle that specific situation. Anything to add there, Ben?
No, that's
I'll just say the whole.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good analogy, and this turns into like turning into building more of a bit of a game plan, right? And that's where going back to jiu-jitsu. I remember when my brother, if people don't know, my brother fought mixed martial arts for many years. He was before the UFC was a big deal. He was fighting in different fight cards and stuff. It was pretty interesting lifestyle to choose and watch, but I'm so happy that I got to be a fan and be a part of it. But when you really start to think about, like, there was a couple times where my brother, he's 6'2", but he fought at 155. So he's walking around 170 and he would cut weight down to 155. And so he's pretty long. And when I say long, like lengthy for a 155 fighter, and his jiu-jitsu is really good. He's a black belt in jiu-jitsu. But he would always, whenever he would fight somebody and knew who he was fighting, they would watch video and stuff, and he would build a game plan. And one of the things with like now he's building a strategy. And when you think about a fight, Nick, you obviously fought MMA a couple of times. You did some boxing as well, but everybody has a puncher's chance. Somebody with zero experience in a cage, you have a puncher's chance. If you land a punch on someone's chin in the right spot, that guy's going to sleep. So there's so many different factors of like defense, offense, when to go. So to build a game plan for a fight is pretty intelligent, because now if you have a game plan to play within your strengths, hey, if the other guy's a good striker and you're good on the ground, well, you want to get that fight to the ground as fast as possible, because if you can get it to the ground as fast as possible, now you're fighting within your strengths. And so this is where the idea of like building a game plan on how to handle situations that correlate with your skills. Again, I see a lot of people talk about the way to handle plays, but if you don't have the sufficient skills to apply to that situation, you can say, oh, I should have, I could have, I would have. But if you don't have the skills that apply to that, well, good luck. And that's
taking that, the example that you just took, you just gave us in a fighting, if you are fighting against a striker, you want to take them down, the plan itself, the tactic itself can be very good. But like you said, if you don't have the skills, if you don't know how to do a double leg takedown, you don't know how to do a throw, you don't know how to do a single leg takedown, good luck applying that tactic to your fight.
Totally, man. And that's one of the things actually I learned from my brother. So I don't know if you remember, Nick, when he fought a guy from Ontario, Chris Horodecki, and he was the main event of that card. After the weigh-ins, I talked to my brother, and he said, he's like, man, like I shocked him with like the length of my arms. Chris Horodecki was a crazy stand-up fighter. He had great stand-up kickboxing skills. My brother's ground game was really good, but his stand-up was really good too. And he was working a lot with Woody Meehan on his stand-up. And he said, man, when we walked up to the podium to like weigh in, he said, when I weighed in, him and his whole team they were looking at the length of my arms going like, we've got like, he's throwing strikes. Like he's going to be able to jab, and you got to get to the inside. So all of a sudden the fight ended up in a no contest because there was an accidental headbutt and a cut opened up. But at the time, like you could see, if you rewatch that fight, you can see like some of the things that Chris Horodecki was throwing was like, he was looking at his corner going like, I don't know what to do here. And again, when you build a game plan and you have an understanding of your own skills, well, you're building that belief system in you. So you have the game plan. We're here to implement the skills and understand, give you the direction in terms of the tactical situation, but now your skills and your ability to read and anticipate go out and put that game plan together. And that's where we're there to help you understand and identify as a goaltender, here's your identity. Here's what you're good at. Play within your strengths. Let's identify areas of weakness and let's turn those areas of weakness into strengths.
I do want to touch on the fact, like, I know I referenced the art of war. We've talked a lot about fighting.
Yeah.
Basically, when we're playing sport is sort of a modified version of a fight or going to war. You know, if you're a goalie, you're not dropping the glove. Well, you might once in a while, but you're not dropping the gloves and you're not fighting. But the idea is competition. It's how can we come up with ways to basically best our opponents. You know, if you're a goalie, your opponent is shooters and teams. A team is designing a power play setup to exploit areas where they might find you deficient or something like that. So the fact that we've referenced fighting and war is not just because we're brutes or anything like that. It's because there's a concept around competition that really emphasizes, as we were talking about, effectiveness, efficiency, and finding the best ways to do things to maximize our advantage and exploit our shooters or team's disadvantages. And as a goalie, you know, you're in a position that's always reactive. We're not necessarily dictating plays or anything like that. But what we do need to do is we need to find ways to better our competition, which is individual shooters. For example, shooters like pushing and pulling and moving with the puck so that they can change angles, as well as the team dynamics of how power plays are set up, lateral passes, teams going behind the net. So the fact that we are referencing war and fighting so much is because that's really the elemental concept behind sport.
Ask any head coach when they're preparing for a big game, they're going to war, right? And it's even players that have that it was actually super cool. We got to chat with Scott, the goaltending coach of the Washington Capitals, who has been working with Logan Thompson. And one of the things that he said at the game was like, he loves that Logan has that dog in him, right? He's got that dog. And it's like, yeah, because he's going to war, man. The guys trust him. He's going to war. He's got that dog in him. And whenever you're in competition, well, what's the outcome? Someone wins and someone loses. It's way better when you win.
There's a reason why this presentation is themed around the Greeks, right? The Greeks are fierce warriors, but also that's where all the most popular philosophers you can think of, most of them come from Greeks. Everything that is based on Western civilization comes from Greece, right? It comes down to democracy and all these ideas. So it's not because we're discussing fighting, we're discussing the philosophy that underlines these competitions, and we can see how it connects to, honestly, it connects to every single sport that you do. It doesn't matter if it's football, baseball, hockey, basketball, any sport you want to think of. There are technical skill requirements in each sport. There's a way that we apply those skills, which is tactical, and there's a philosophy that underlines what it means to be an athlete and somebody that plays within a team. So now, going from the philosophy of tactics, now we're going to go back again to the idea of our on-ice structure. So as we discussed earlier, the OSD program, we will shoot ourselves. So the technical skills are all the same across the boards. But tactics is where we start introducing players. We start getting more dynamic with our drills, but it's still fairly structured. It's dynamic but structured in a way that we approach our training method. Now, because we do this, we will bring shooters in that are typically not necessarily the same age, because it's one of those things. If you have a U13 goalie on the ice and you bring out U13 players, the way that the players execute the drill might not be sufficient enough. They might not be consistent enough in being able to apply the drill. So we might have U18 players or U15 players shooting on U13 kids. But obviously, we do a good job of policing how hard and how dynamic the players are in a drill sequences. But we try to bring out a little bit older shooters so that we're actually able to execute the drills sufficient enough that we can actually get some proper repetitions in. But we do bring in shooters, and because we bring in shooters, this is where we start to segregate the goalies based on skill level and age group. Because again, if we have our pro group out on the ice, we want to have guys that are able to shoot on them sufficiently enough to be able to challenge them. We can't just have U18 players shooting on an AHLer. In most cases, just because their skills are not nearly the same. That being said, though, this is where we start separating into age groups. Now, the way that we do a structure for the PSD is a little bit different. While in the OSD, we're doing 1 ice time per week and focusing on the quality of the ice time. Not that we're not going to focus on quality again, but now we have the goalies on the ice 3 times a week over the PSD, because now we're getting closer to our tryouts. We want to try to ramp up the amount of ice times that we're doing. And the structure that we have for that program is a little bit different, where the first ice time of the week is where it's us shooting, but we focus on tactical drills. So now, instead of just, let's say, I'll use a simple example like butterfly slides. Instead of focusing on the mechanics of the butterfly slide, now we're gonna discuss the application of that butterfly slide, shoulder checks, depth management, all these things, and we'll be shooting ourselves. Then the second ice time is when we bring out the shooters. Now the first ice time we know we focus on the details that are going to be required to understand how to handle those situations in a tactical environment. Now we bring the shooters for the second ice time, and now we do the situation in a more dynamic environment, where now we have actual passes. Now they can apply those concepts in a more dynamic environment. And then we finish off the week with a movement circuit, and the movement circuit is, again, team based around the theme of the week. So if during the week we'll focus on lateral feeds as a concept, the movement circuit is going to be focused on lateral feeds. This is where really goalies are able to compound their reps. At the end of the week, if the goalies had trouble, let's say, with when they're adjusting their depth, their base is getting wider as they're drifting back. Well, now in the movement circuit, they're able to compound more reps, or they focus on that specific detail to make sure they're able to build proper habits as they go through those ice times. So, fellas, when it comes up to the on-ice structure, is there anything that you'd like people to know that makes it different, or things that we look at that to allow goalies to proliferate when it comes down to their development?
Well, just real quick, just talking about like how thorough it is. And when I say how thorough it is, again, 3 ice times a week, it sounds like there's a lot going on, in which there is. But when you go into the idea of like what the first ice time is, well, the first ice time during the OSD, we've acquired the skill. Now the first ice time of the PSD, we're going to go out there, and that skill that you've acquired, now we're going to translate to where it applies. And then we're going to replicate that the second ice time into real live action. And as soon as you put it into real live action, now there's a little bit of a trial and error, because it's all going to be based on the goaltender's ability. And when I say goaltender's ability, their ability to move, their ability to read and anticipate. So now as you do a little bit of trial and error, you can understand like depth adjustments, staying with passes, having different speeds of passes, all of those different situations. But now that the goalie is actually going through and seeing where that skill is translatable, but also individually building the tactical situation that's going to allow for them to handle those situations that are required in a lateral feed situation. And then the third ice time being a movement circuit, well, as it's a movement circuit, as the third ice time, the whole idea now is to again replicate that, but you're having to visualize those things. So now we're compounding the idea of not just the physical, you're also mentally having to go through these things as well. And we're building repetition on top of that. And as you build repetition on top of that, it's not muscle memory. What we're doing is, again, talking about when Ben talked about like the two different neurological pathways, you're adding and you're compounding onto the one that's the most efficient, or the one you're going to most likely use instinctually. And it again connects the dots of the circle or the triangle, right? It connects it all together in terms of how you're going to apply your techniques to tactical situations.
I like this for 2 reasons. Like, one is the degree of difficulty as you're moving up. So degree of difficulty, starting with the OSD, initially we're focusing on skill development in a really static environment. Now you're moving up a layer of difficulty where you're applying that skill in a static situation, and then another layer of difficulty where you're applying that skill in a dynamic situation. So that's the first connection that I like between like the OSD and the PSD, and how those two directly connect to one another. Because again, even in the situation where we'll have shooters, it will be, 2 shooters, one pass, whereas apply that to a power play setup, for example, you have 5 shooters, multiple passes. So we're moving up degrees of difficulty. But the other reason I like this approach is going back to the difference between or when people say coaching robots. Well, we've done the quote robotic side. We've done the consistent side of everybody has to apply the same skills, regardless of age, regardless of skill level. The techniques the goalies will all use is the same. They're all identical. However, now when we get into that individual component, this is where the human side of things comes in. This is where the innovation side, the creativity side, and the individual differences, this is where we start to learn more about ourselves. And going back to Justin, what you talked about the individual skills, are you someone who prefers to move on their feet or on their knees? Would you prefer to shuffle on a play or slide on a play? This is where we can start to have that discussion and really add the creativity of ourselves into how we as an individual decide to play the game. So we're taking that fundamental, which, you could say is robotic, is consistent because everybody has to do the same thing. But, if you watch our Instagram, all of our goalies do the exact same skills, but none of them look the same. They all look totally different because they're all different players. They're all different individuals. And this is where we get to choose how we want to best handle certain situations.
A good example for this would be there's two goalies that we work with that are playing D1 college in the same league. And if they're the exact same age, they've played together all the way up. And we did a drill where the passes are going, they're starting off on their post. The puck was going low to mid, side to side. One of them was sliding, one of them was shuffling all the way across. And interestingly enough, the smaller goalie was sliding, the bigger goalie was staying on his feet shuffling. So when you really potentially think it'd be the opposite, right? But at the end of the day, they fundamentally follow the same rules. They're moving side to side. So the direction of their movement, the path that we're taking to put themselves in position was the same, irrespective as to what type of movement they were using. One of them was shuffling, one of them was sliding, but the path that we're taking was the exact same because, as we know in the OSD, that is the technical way of doing things. From there, both of them were staying with pass. None of them were beating the pass. And both of them were doing a good job of staying reactive as they were moving. They were just trying to fill space. So fundamentally, they're doing the exact same thing, but the application of those fundamentals is different because they were utilizing a different movement. So they're applying proper direction movement, they were staying with pass, and they were reactive. However, they were using a different movement. And both of them were very effective and efficient and had a high level of consistency going through that drill. They're able to put themselves in the position to make saves each time. So it just goes to show that the PSD is where, like Ben, you said, the individuality starts coming in. This is where goalies will start to adapt based on what they think is best for them, see what works for them, and be able to apply it in a proper way. Are there disadvantages to sliding over shuffling? Of course there is. But are there disadvantages to shuffling instead of sliding? Yes, there is. What matters to us is that in the OSD, the goalies are able to build those skills so that when they get into PSD, even if they utilize the skill differently, at least they're able to adjust. Meaning, if the goalie who likes to slide, that is what they prefer to do in general, that is okay with us as long as they're effective and efficient in the way that they do it. But underlying this is we want to make sure that if they had to switch to a shuffle, maybe they're playing it later on, they'll be playing against a team that when they receive the puck low to mid, they move the puck back to the middle for a shot on net. Well, the goalie who's sliding might have trouble changing direction in that situation. So as long as we know that they have the skill needed to potentially shuffle and adjust based on that game, then we're okay with it, because we know that the reason why you're doing this, you're sliding, is because it truly fits your gameplay better. You're not doing it out of necessity because you're not able to do these other skills. And that's, I think, one of the biggest differences is when you have goalies who say that they prefer to do things a certain way, but it's not because they prefer it because they are able to do the alternatives, but they prefer that one way of doing it. But they say they prefer it because they can't do the other skills. There's a difference between the two there.
Yeah,
well, again,
a good example. Do you mind if I just share an example quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's like we talk about post play a lot. Post play is big, and we are still believers in VH, vertical horizontal, which a lot of guys don't really work with or learn. So, for example, if you have a younger goalie who uses their RVH on shots from above goal line, they might be getting scored high. And I've had examples where it's like, well, let's try VH. And they're like, well, I don't like VH because it feels uncomfortable. I prefer to be in RVH. Like, okay, then you're just going to get scored on. Like, you're still young, maybe you can react, but you don't have the coverage. So this is a skill that we need to learn to be able to adapt. So that's a situation where you see guys say that they prefer something because it's what they've done before, what they've learned, and what they know how to do, regardless of whether it's effective or not.
Well, I'm just going to take that to an example that we had this year is Hauser. When Daniel Hauser started the season, we had a conversation with him, and he was saying, he's like, I'm really finding, like, at times I feel like I'm sliding and getting back to my feet for a shot. And so a lot of times people would say, oh, that's wrong. And it's like, it's not wrong at all, man. Well, and then he showed us an example, and it was a pass sort of like from high to mid. he slides across, gets back to his feet, guy zaps it, he makes a big glove save. And so like I asked him, like, what's wrong about that play? There's nothing wrong about that play. All it was, man, when you were on angle, when the player that passed the puck, you were in great position. If he shoots the puck, you're in a good spot to make a save. He passes the puck though, you regain position, feet to knees. If that guy would have one-timed the puck, well, you're in a better spot to make a save anyways. But because you stayed connected to puck, you were able to get back to your feet as that guy received the puck. So you're in position, you're on angle, you have body position, and now you're just making a save from your feet. Some people will say, again, and I think we talked about this. Some people say, well, he's sliding, he's wasting way more energy, and it's like, more energy for what? Like, what are you saving your energy for? He got back to his feet and made a save. What's wrong about that? And Instagram might blow up and say, oh, he's sliding too much, he's slide happy. But at the end of the day, he's very, very effective moving laterally while down. So ultimately, if that pass is going across and he slides all the way across, but stays with puck the entire way, and that guy receives it and he gets in position and regains his feet, what's the difference if he was just to move from feet to feet? There really is no difference because that save still came from his feet. But because there's this perception of wrong versus right, rather than being him and playing within his strengths, that's where you're going to get negative kickback. At the end of the day, it was a great save. Never question a save. And the whole idea, again, when it came down to him, I asked him, I said, like, do you feel like that was wrong? And he's like, well, no, the result was a save. And it's like, well, then, man, quit questioning it. You don't need to question it anymore. You just answered your own question by being fully comfortable. You're Daniel Hauser. Play within Daniel Hauser's strengths rather than what some guy you've never met before thinks.
That's the important part too, about like going back to the calculations of all the possible scenarios, not just reflecting on what actually happened. You know, Nick, talking about like that situation with the low to mid, and it's like, what if they kick it back to the middle? Well, there are certain things that may be more efficient than others. You know, in that Hauser case, what if he one-timed that puck? You had to slide. Yeah. It's not that you chose to slide. It's that sliding was the best scenario for what was actually happening. Totally. And then the guy chose not to shoot the puck. He chose to catch it and corral it. And you adapted well to that situation. Totally. So for us, the idea of tactics is not just what happened. It's all the potentials of what could happen.
What could happen. That's the thing, man, is that you can what if everything, right? You can what if everything. What if that guy would have shot it and it would have deflected off your D-man's skate? What if that guy one-times it? What if that guy misses the pass and it turns into a dump in? What if, and the whole thing is like, how did the result end? Or it resulted in a save that you made? Good read, man. Good read.
You have to handle situations as they present themselves, right? So you have to handle it as is, not what it potentially could be, right?
Yeah.
If somebody's attacking your net from below the goal line and you're on your post and they come in tighter proximity, could they, if they want to skate behind a net? For sure, right? That could happen. But right now what's happening is that players attacking your goal line, is attacking tight to your post. So you don't really have a choice but to handle as is and go down into your RVH. You can stay over top of it and handle that situation as it presents itself. If the player decides to, as he's attacking, coming in close, decides to then peel back and go behind your net, now we're going to handle the situation that is. Now we are now tracking behind net. We need to be able to utilize that be able to apply our behind the net tracking tactics from our knees, right? The situation that you talk about with Hauser is, you know, are there certain things that if a goalie slides instead of shuffling, let's say on a side-to-side play, well, the advantage of sliding is maybe, well, in general, is if a shot gets released, obviously you can react as you're moving. The disadvantage you're on your knees. If the player doesn't take a shot, you have to get back up to your feet. Some goalies, when they get back up to their feet, will arrive wide. And as they arrive wide, that affects their mobility, that affects their save attempt. So for us now, it's not necessarily you should shuffle, you should slide, is, hey, you prefer to slide, that's fine, but just watch out that if you have to get back up to your feet, your base has to come back underneath you. That's something you got to watch out for. Now, for a goalie's playing style, for Daniel Hauser, because he prefers to slide, that's something that he has to make sure he keeps an eye on. He's going to make sure his base stays underneath him. Somebody who prefers to shuffle, maybe for them, the issue is a little bit different, is as they shuffle, they have to make sure they're managing that properly, because shuffling, you're going up against your blade, and because you're going against your blade, you need more power to be able to carry distance. So if somebody likes to shuffle, but they're starting off from their positional range is too high and it can't carry distance, that becomes a problem. So now maybe the adjustments for somebody who likes to shuffle is maybe they have to adjust their depth accordingly, right? So this is where really fundamentally the function is the same. Our function is to try to make a save, but how we apply it's going to be different. And now what our job is to work around the athlete to make it work for them.
Well, and so I'm just going to take that real quick too and say that's another reason why I don't believe in zone mapping. I don't believe that that you can put a zone and say, hey, I'm going to color this purple and I'm going to color this blue. And in this situation, this is where you need to be. Or only use RVH in the golden triangle. There's no golden triangle. There's no purple spot on the ice. The whole thing now is there's constant movement, and the game has gotten so dynamic. Again, if you think there's a zone map that says, oh, hey, use RVH in this situation, only behind the net and only in the golden triangle, well, watch the Colorado Avalanche just swarm around the ice, man. That changes like that, right? Those situations change like that. So now the whole idea is like, let's acquire the skills so we can adapt to those situations rather than say, oh man, it was in the golden triangle and it still went in. Well, the whole idea now is like the play is getting dynamic. There's scouting reports on guys. We're obviously working on doing scouting reports for a lot of guys. So there's tendencies that happen. So now all of a sudden, if we just have this, hey, the puck was in the purple area and I need to be in RVH, and the puck goes in. Well, now does that change the entire process? Now we have to acquire new skills and we have to have a better map. No, let's acquire all the skills and the reason anticipations so we can handle situations and adapt to what's happening around us rather than what we hope happens around us.
So now moving on, we have the in-season development. This is where we're transitioning again to a different phase of our development. We're in the off-season again, in the OSD. We're not playing as much. We're focusing more on technical skills. We get skill acquisition. We get into the PSD program. The PSD program, now we are applying those skills in game-like situations where our drills get a little bit more dynamic, where goalies have to read and anticipate plays. In-season development, this is where goalies focus more on the adaptation of their skill. What we mean by adaptation is everybody will play at a different level, will play on a different team that has different strengths and weaknesses, right? Some teams might be seeing a lot of the scoring situation they might see might be more based on traffic being present in front of the net. Other teams might be very offensive minded, and in the scoring situation, he sees when there is a rush coming back in their zone. So every team is different, and goalies now have to adapt and evolve the way they play based on not only their skills and the way they like to handle situation, but also they have to adapt around what their teammates do. So this is where we enter into a little bit of a different phase of our development. We call it skill adaptation, where we are adapting to the situation that we are seeing, and those situations are going to be based on what our skill level is, and what our teammates do, and the teams that we're seeing that we're playing against. Now, when we think about the philosophy again of adaptation, this is where the Greeks had the prosarmorzo. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. The idea of adjusting, aligning oneself to concepts to better fit new circumstances. So the circumstances are new now. We're playing on a team, and again, our teams will be different based on who our teammates are, who our coach is, what our systems are as a team. So what we'll be seeing is going to be different across the board. So really, what we're trying to do during the ISD program is trying to work on to refine our skills so that we can create consistency throughout the season. And our coaching style, not that what we teach will be different. Everything that we teach is very consistent, but what we focus on might be a little bit different, where it might be a little bit of a mix of technical skills and tactical skills put together. And this is where even in that program, the way that we do videos is a little bit different. So our classrooms in the OSD and the PSD are more focused on concepts and the application of concepts. But our classroom at this moment are focused more on what the goalies have issues with. So the goalies that are in our programs can upload game clips into their Google Drive folder. And then during our classrooms, we will review those clips with them just to see what kind of situations they're seeing and what they individually need to focus on as the season goes through. So some goalies might be seeing more, like we said earlier, 2-on-1s, just because their team is very offensive in the offensive zone. And when they lose puck possession, they have to back check and everything, and it ends up being an odd man rush. And because they're seeing a lot of 2-on-1s, we have to specifically focus on how to handle those situations and try to optimize the way that they do so. While another goalie might be seeing more traffic situations. Maybe their team takes a lot of penalties, and because their team takes a lot of penalties, they're playing 5-on-4. There's a lot of traffic in that front, and those are the situations that they need to adapt to more often. So that phase of development is a little bit different, where we're trying to combine the OSD, the PSD together and adapt to the situation that the individual goalie might be seeing in their games.
And the way I see that too is like just almost like individual problem solving at that scenario. If you, as we've acquired the skills and we've understood how those skills apply to game situations, now individually some people might have some issues, some underlying issues in situations that someone else doesn't. For instance, I'll talk about the two guys that we have right now in the NHL with Hayden Hill and Logan Thompson. They both have gone through the same type of training. We've had those guys since they were young. They're both playing in the National Hockey League. But when you watch them play, they're completely different. So when they're completely different, the way they handle situations is a little bit different because just something, maybe it's a mobility thing. One guy feels better. Earlier you were talking about, Nick, that moving from feet to feet versus feet to knees. So that situation changes. So as soon as you get in season, you start to understand a little bit more about yourself and the application and the skill application and all those things, how they connect. And now it's different for everybody. Maybe if you're working on the Tuesday group at Rocky Ridge, and the two guys that you have in your net, you're working on lateral feeds. The two guys you have in your net, one guy's super efficient and is having no problems with that, where the other guy might be having a situation where he's having problems getting north-south or whatever it may be. So now this is more of like an individual. You're solving problems, but you're solving problems more tactically because the results are coming from your games. So we get to see, and how many times has this happened? It's happened to me many times where I've worked with somebody for a while, have never seen them play games. I've just seen them during goalie specific skates, and then you watch them play a game, and it's nothing like they're not really playing with that much structure. So now you start to implement structure. I'll give an example. I did a game review for somebody, maybe it was last season, and they told me, they were like, I'm having problems with understanding the differences like blocking and reacting. And so when I watched the video, it had nothing to do with blocking and reacting. It had to do with the structure of how they were handling the rush. There was no consistency on how they're handling the rush. So they were chasing plays, or in situations because they would chase a play and the result wouldn't happen. So then the next time they would handle it, they were playing very, very deep, and then they were getting beat from shots from further out. So the whole idea, it had nothing to do with blocking and reacting. It had to do with adding structure to how they were handling the thing you see most in the game, and that's a playoff rush. As soon as we understood that, and I saw that it was in their gameplay, they were having struggles. The next ice that we implemented for in the in-season had to do with handling the rush a little more consistently, and all of a sudden, hey, results changed overnight. So it comes down to, again, the whole idea is like it's individual problem solving now as in season, but we're still connecting the dots with the same skills and the same tactics. It's just a matter of now more individual because we get to see them during their game events, right? Now games are happening, and now there's an actual measuring stick where it comes into your results in game situation.
For the in-season program as well, we put a big emphasis on adapting skills that we do in our goalie sessions, in our academies, to practice. Because this is a time where during the off-season and the preseason development program, probably 90% of the ice times that you're going to do are goalie sessions, or that's what we would recommend at least. The goalies really stay away from player ice times where they're getting peppered on shots from the hash mark so that they can actually develop their game awareness of how they want to play the game. On the in-season development program, that changes a little bit. It's going to be probably 1 out of 6 ice times that they're going to do throughout a week are going to be goalie ice times. So we have to switch our model a little bit to be, again, more adaptive to how goalies are going to spend most of their time. So we put a really strong emphasis, again, reiterating and doing maintenance and maintaining skills and tactics that we've already learned through the OSD and the PSD. But now a lot of times at the end or during drills, we'll say, what are your practices look like? How are your practices structured? Let's talk about ways where you can adapt these skills for your practices to be more beneficial to your games, because we have a lot less control over what goalies do outside of the academies during these times during the season. And so we really do put a strong emphasis on making your practices as beneficial for you as possible. And we do that through the development of the skills in the goalie sessions, and then having the conceptual understanding to apply it on your own.
So that kind of brings us to the idea of the on-ice structure there, Ben, because that connects very well. While we still make sure that we are taking a layered approach, we don't want to just jump from one thing to the other. This is because we're in the in-season. This is where really, even as coaches, we have to adapt to what we're seeing out of our goalies, and because the amount of ice that they have with us is limited, and they're going to be on the ice more with their teams. This is where, for us personally, we have to do a good job of figuring out where we can get the highest level of return on our time investment, right? If there's certain skills, let's say right now in our program, we have 4 ice times left, and there are multiple situations that we haven't really covered in our program yet before that we won't get to cover before the end of the program. Well, now we have to be able to figure out what is it that's going to give us the best return on our time investment before the program ends, so that the goalies can utilize those skills into their games and have a higher level of consistency, right? So whether that is we think that putting more time into our post connections will be more effective over the long term versus putting more time into rush management, that we will go in that direction. So that's one thing that's a little bit different here, is because the time is a little bit limited. We need to get performance out of our athletes throughout the season. We're not in the off season where we're not playing and we have 5 months to get ready for next season, right? We're in the season right now. So because time is limited, we really make sure that in our programs, we do a good job investing our time as coaches properly into the details that we need to focus on that's going to give us the highest return on that time invested. So that just connects everything together. So we have the ISD, we have the OSD, we have the PSD, and those three programs put together is what gives us a holistic model to basically to be able to develop the goalies throughout a full year. And so while we do summer camps, 1 week long summer camps, we see summer camps as great for people that we don't see very often, right? People that are from out of town. Like where Justin and I will be going back to Korea again this year for the Korean goalies, we will have to apply a camp model to the development sessions that we'll be doing because our time in Korea is going to be very limited. For the goalies that are around our area, we prefer that instead of doing a summer camp, that they think about doing programs that are lasting over a longer period of time, because it'll be easier for them to be able to build the habits and over time be able to connect the dots better and be able to reinforce those dots as they go through. So we go from skill acquisition to skill application to skill adaptation, and that cycle, those steps recycle themselves as we go through the season. Is there anything to add there, fellas, before we finish this call?
Ultimately, just the whole idea again, when we break down like those ISD, OSD, PSD, and how they connect to each other, is we're not really the type of goaltending coaches or company that's, I would say that we don't skate. It's not a matter of going to skate. We train. And when I say train, that the reason is goaltending is probably the hardest, most dynamic position in all of sport. Doing the bare minimum will get you minimum results. Not saying that that you can't have natural abilities, but at the same time, like if you want to compete at the highest levels, hockey has become a lifestyle. Hockey is no longer a sport where leisurely, if you aspire to play at the NHL, now you can play leisurely. Don't get me wrong, you can totally play leisurely and play at the highest level that you see yourself fit. Cool. But if you truly want to live the dream and you want to play at the highest levels, you have to, there is some time investment for sure. And that's where I find training is way more effective than the idea of skating, because you're actually acquiring something and you're doing something where you're taking steps and you're making progress and you're climbing to the top of the pyramid. Where skating, you might get a step up on the pyramid, but if you skate once and then we don't see somebody for a couple of weeks, the retention and the quick progress or the progression really slows down. So I really truly believe that there's a huge difference between training and skating. And I think that the differences are results and how fast those results come. I don't think that you have to work towards the idea of burnout, but I also think that by having a model that you follow, you're going to eliminate the idea of burnout, because the times that you take breaks are going to be very efficient. Times when you should take breaks, not when you're leading up to something. And then at the same time, in terms of how you're acquiring those skills and applying those skills, it comes in phases, right? And when you think about the OSD, why is the OSD so important? Well, that's where we acquire the skill. Well, if you're acquiring the skill and you're not playing games because it's the off season, well, you shouldn't have to worry about burnout. Now, if you're playing a whole bunch of games, and back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I know spring hockey started to take over the idea of the winter season. And that really affected the way goaltenders developed, because no longer in the offseason were you able to acquire the skill. You needed results because everyone was so worried about tournaments. I'm happy that has fully changed, and spring hockey has definitely become a lesser of value, because I coached in the Western Hockey League for a number of years. I don't know many Western Hockey League scouts that really cared so much about the summer hockey thing. I remember coaching a team. We steamrolled. We had a team that I coached, Ryan Papuano, the head coach of the Brooks Bandits, head coach GM. He was the head coach of that spring team. We had every player from the first 2 rounds of the Bantam draft. We had Ty Ratty. We were stacked. We went to tournaments. We were steamrolling teams. In the finals, it was like 11-0, 11-1. Austin Smith was our goalie. We were very, very powerful. And the scouts, I was with the Kootenai Ice at the time. The scouts that I would talk to about our guys, they didn't care. It was like, oh man, I'm on my summer break. I'm at the lake in Kelowna on a boat right now. I don't care what's happening in Airdrie, Alberta. The scouting and those things, they happen during the winter months because the Bantam draft happens in the off season. So the whole idea when it comes down to like the models and stuff, by having a solid development plan and a model that you're following, that's the recipe for results. If it's just random ice times that you're going to, understand the results are probably going to be a lot lesser than if you actually valued the model that you were following.
I like to conceptualize like the difference between a cycle and a spiral. And the reason why I think of a cycle versus a spiral, and it's happened with us before, where if we think in terms of development, like our OSD, PSD, and ISD, that's throughout the course of a season. That's throughout one full calendar year, I should say, not a season. That's about 1 full calendar year. But when you think of your career starting at, say, age 11, and then hopefully going till you're age 40, if you're lucky enough to be a guy like Marc-Andre Fleury, hopefully going till you're age 40. A lot of times we've had goalies who have been training with us for a long time, not do the OSD and kind of start at the PSD, or goalies thinking that they should start at the PSD because they're older or a higher level, maybe like a AAA, AA kind of player. And it's like, I don't necessarily need to pare things down so much, because it can be conceptualized, or can be seen that the OSD, again, if you go through the course of a full calendar year, is back at the bottom of the cycle. It's the skill development. It's actually like how to move, how to make saves, going back to really, really paring down fundamentals. However, when we start to think, if we think in terms of a spiral rather than simply a cycle, think of a spiral moving upward. You may be coming back to the initial starting point of the spiral, but you're way higher up in year 2 than you are in year 1. And then same thing, you go through the spiral again in year 3. Although you're back to working on the fundamentals, where you actually are, again, in the scale of the pyramid, if you're spiraling around, moving up layers, every year that you come back to the OSD, you're to like the base fundamental layer, you're much higher up the pyramid than you were at the starting point. And then the next calendar year, you're much higher up than you were at the starting point. So the idea of that upward spiral year over year over year, that's where, going back to what you were saying, Justin, that's where we start to get long-lasting development, which leads to consistent results.
That's it. Love it.
Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time.